Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you again for joining us today for our presentation, Communicate to Connect, Strategies for Powerful Customer Experiences. In today's presentation, we will explore how simple language shifts can transform a brand's customer relationship. My name is Ashley Wolf, and I'm the Senior Marketing Manager here at FuelCycle, and I'm very excited to have you all with us today. Before we start, I have a few housekeeping items I just wanted to go over. If you have any questions at any time throughout today's presentations, please feel free to submit them to either the question or chat box inside the GoToWebinar interface. We will catalog them throughout and come back to them at the end of the presentation. Also, I wanted to mention, if you haven't joined us before, we have a substantial catalog of case studies, white papers, webinars, and industry resources located at fuelcycle.com. I encourage you all to take a look at them when you have time. So again, today's webinar should take about 30 to 35 minutes, and then we will go into a 10 to 15-minute Q&A session. So with that, I would like to introduce one of our presenters today. Rick is FuelCycle's in-house expert on insights and customer experience. He has spent most of his career in the market research industry, working closely with clients and operations teams to ensure clients' needs are met. Also, recently, in addition to his research background, Rick is now a member of the CX at Rutgers program. Thank you for joining us today, Rick.
Yeah, thank you for having me. Excited to talk.
Thank you. Our other presenter today, which we're very excited to have joining with us, is Adam Toporek. He is an internationally recognized customer service expert, keynote speaker, frontline trainer, and author of Be Your Customer's Hero. He helps organizations think differently about customer service. Thank you for joining us today, Adam.
Oh, thanks so much for having me. Super excited for the presentation. We've got some great stuff to talk about.
Wonderful. Well, with that, I am actually going to turn it over to you, Adam, to kick us off.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Ashley. So we have our agenda today, and this is pretty rough, but it's customer psychology, because that underpins everything we're going to talk about with communication. We're going to talk about the impact of negativity and negative language, and then talk a little bit about some techniques and strategies, including closing the loop, that you can use with your customers. So let us jump right in. All right, so we live in amazing times. And we've probably learned more about the inner workings of psychology and the human brain in the last few decades than probably all of human history before that. So we now know what different parts of the brain do. We have access to brain scans that can actually show us what's happening to the brain in certain situations. We can also monitor chemicals in the blood and hormones. And not to mention, on top of that, the scientific method is advanced. We have rigorous scientific testing, which is building upon years of previous testing, and that has all revealed amazing insights. Now, when it comes to the brain, what we don't know is still probably greater than what we do. But what the last few decades have shown is that we've learned so much that it can truly shape how we understand how customers behave, and also how we can communicate with them more effectively. So we can't obviously get into everything we have learned, but let's talk about a few of the key points that really affect us in our customer relationships. Sorry, getting used to the lag here. First is our instinctual survival brain has an incredible impact on our thinking. And you should always be taking the survival brain into consideration when you're working with customers and when you're crafting your communication. And we're going to dig into how that works and why that is in a few moments. Next is humans are irrational and make decisions primarily emotionally. So most of you are familiar with some of these things. There's been a lot of talk about the irrational customer and cognitive biases, which is one of the ways this manifests. And we're going to dig into some of that. But this dynamic is crucial in understanding customers, because often if you ask that question, why is this customer acting like this? The answer most of the time is the customer doesn't have a clue why they're acting like that. And we know more about why that is now. And finally, language and words matter more than we ever thought. And one of the things we're going to focus on today is how to understand how those first two ideas informs what we know about language and communication. So let's talk a little bit about the survival brain. Okay, so our brain has evolved physically over millions of years. Our society has evolved over thousands of years, and digital technology has only evolved over the past few decades. And the reality is our brains haven't kept up. We still have caveman brains. So we're designed to look for scarcity or threat, lack or attack. And that makes sense because it wasn't that long ago we needed to know if that noise in the bushes was a bunny or a tiger. But the catch is that survival brain, as we'll call it for sort of shorthand today, has a big impact on how we behave and how we interact with others. So I'm going to do a little quick exercise I do in my trainings and my customer service workshops. If you're somewhere where somebody can see you, it's up to you. But if you are somewhere where you won't be embarrassed, just look up at the ceiling real quickly. And just stare at the ceiling and focus on the ceiling and imagine it cracking and imagine it about to fall in on you. And the question I ask is this: if that was happening, would you be able to pay attention to anything I was saying? Of course not. And why? It's pretty obvious, because we're focused on survival. We're focused on our physical safety. But this dynamic is exactly what happens on to our brain on a subtle, unconscious scale. So we're wired for these quick decisions. We're wired to protect ourselves. And one of the ways that happens is through what I mentioned earlier, which is called cognitive biases. And cognitive biases are systematic errors in thinking that make people deviate from rationality or good judgment. Now, one of the most famous of these, and you may have heard of this, is negativity bias. And it essentially says that we give greater weight to negative information than we do to positive information. We give it more attention and we value it more. Why? Because negative information can represent a threat. And our brain is there to ensure our survival first and foremost. So this same mechanism actually affects us in our daily life. Just like the ceiling is falling. If you're focused on that, you can't focus on what I'm saying. Here's an example from everyday life. Who here has heard the expression, if it bleeds, it leads? So the local news does this all the time, right? And I came across this doing research for my next book, which is about a lot of the topics we're talking about today, the brain and its impact on communication. And I literally chose Oklahoma City randomly, sorry if you're from Oklahoma City, and Googled local news, clicked on one, and went straight to the homepage to see what I got. And this is what I got. If you look at the red highlights, you'll notice that even the sort of positive ones, and there's a handful of positive themed ones, have some sort of scare word in them. And by the way, they did misspell robbery up there at the top. But that's the key. Even the positive headlines have scare words in them. And what does our brain catch? It catches the negative. It focuses on the negative. And I'm sure you've all had this experience. You had a customer, you've done everything right. It's been a great relationship. And you did one thing wrong, and what did they focus on? That one thing wrong. Or you've sent a communication, and it has 3 pieces of good news and maybe 1 piece of news that's not so great. And what do you think people are going to focus on? So this dynamic is super powerful, and it gets down to a level, and this is where it really gets exciting, where we're learning about the brain. Just the word no. Now, we use the word all the time, right? It's either a yes or a no. It's part of our language. It's a super common word. One doctor actually called it the most dangerous word in the world. They did a study. They put people in fMRI scanners, which sort of does how the brain lights up. And all they did was flash no for 1 second. Actually, I think it was less than a second. And what they found was just seeing the word no for less than a second created a sudden release of dozens of stress-producing hormones. So chemicals that immediately interrupt the functioning of the brain, impair logic, language processing, communication. So here's my question to you. How often do you have to say no? How often does your team have to say no, your organization? And it's not just no, it's can't or won't or any type of negative language. There was another study that said just seeing a list of negative words for a few seconds will make a highly anxious person or depressed person feel worse. And it can actually damage the structures in your brain that regulate your memory, feelings, and emotions. It can disrupt your sleep, your appetite. And all of this may not happen just because you say no once to a customer. But what's important to know is that this is what negative language does to the human brain. This is what's happening under the surface. And we accept this language as part of our normal vocabulary, but the science is telling us that we need to really reevaluate that. All right, so in the book, Words Can Change Your Brain, which is obviously on topic here, they actually, on positive language, they said a single word has the power to influence the expression of genes that regulate physical and emotional stress. So that means positive words, peace, love, anything like that, can literally strengthen how our brain, the frontal lobes, and promote their cognitive function. So it's very interesting if you look at it from a standpoint of positive language and negative language. We're not trying to rewire our customers' brains this way, but we want to use words associated with positive responses and not with negative responses. You may be familiar with the old phrase, it's not what you say, it's how you say it. I'm here to tell you that the science is telling us that it is very much what you say and how you say it. All right, let's talk a little bit about another psychological principle that can impact our communication. This is called priming. And you may have heard of this. It's basically, I'll give you an example. So in the book Predictably Irrational, Dan Ariely is a reputed professor of psychology. He described an experiment in which participants, they're all college students, they're all young, they're asked to rearrange random words into sentences. And one of the groups had basically words that were priming the concept of the elderly. Florida, bingo, ancient. And I'm in Florida right now and from Florida, so I take a little bit of exception to this. But the group, and this was the interesting part, of course the experiment wasn't the experiment, it had nothing to do with the sentences. The real research was they timed the students walking down the hall after the experiment. And the participants in the experimental group, the ones that had the words, the elderly type words, their walking speed was actually considerably slower than that of the control group who had not been primed. So why this is important is because we often think about what we're saying. And what priming tells us is that the components, the pieces of what we're saying, can also have an impact completely devoid of the context itself. So some words automatically prime the listener. For example, how often do we use unfortunately? When you use unfortunately, what is the next thing that happens? What does the listener expect? Bad news. Somebody says unfortunately to us that we are already prepared before we even hit the comma to know that what's coming is news we're not going to like. So that's a form of priming right there, using this language that has this already association in it. Another one, but. So I do a thing in my training where I say, what comes before but? Nothing comes before but. And use sentence, whenever you hear but, you know the real answer, the real message of the statement is after the word but. Now this is something that can be used positively or negatively. Usually it's used negatively. I'd love to do something for you, but I can't. However, if you know this principle, you can actually use this priming for positive effect. You can restructure your communication so that the positive message is at the end of but. There's an idea of anchoring too. And we're going to be hitting a lot of little topics here as we approach sort of the techniques and how to talk about this. And this was a really interesting one. So we talk about priming, that means the individual word has an impact. Well, there's something called anchoring, which means a number or a word can also affect your decision making. And they did this study, and it was they spun a wheel of fortune essentially, and it had a 10 or a 65. It had all kinds of numbers, but it was rigged so it landed on 10 or 65. And then they asked the question, how many African countries were part of the United Nations? So when they asked people to estimate what they thought the actual percentage was, the people who landed on 10 in the first half of the experiment guessed around 25% of Africa was part of the UN. Those who landed on 65 said around 45%. Nothing was different about the questioning, only the number they landed on a roulette wheel. And all kinds of studies have borne this out. They did a study on like paying for dinner and basically found that people would pay a higher price at a restaurant called Studio 97 instead of Studio 17. So the key message, the key takeaway here is that pieces outside of the structure of the communication itself can really matter. And with that, let's look at framing. And this framing talks about the actual structure of the communication. So this little picture is based on a classic study, which was they presented people 90% lean beef or 10% fat beef. Same exact thing. What did people choose? Overwhelmingly, they chose the lean beef. So that means the same information, depending on how it's presented, obviously can have a different effect. So how does this relate to customer communication? Well, we talked about positivity and negativity and the truly detrimental effects that negative information can have on our listener. And so often our customer communication can be negative. So one of the things to do, one of the techniques is to reframe any type of negative news as much as possible. Sometimes you twist yourself into a pretzel and it's not possible. But to reframe things that are negative to a positively framed presentation. All right, now this is a fairly interesting topic, and this has to do with where our attention goes. So that quote on the board there is from Daniel Kahneman, and he's an Israeli-American psychologist. He did all types of work. He basically just about invented behavioral economics, which is a lot of what the sort of modern talk about is now. And I won the Nobel Prize in economics. And essentially what he found and what he says is nothing in life is as important as you think it is while you are thinking about it. And what that means is what we are focused on is perceived as important. And the second factor is what we are focused on is also perceived as causal. So Robert Cialdini has a great quote. He basically says, the factor most likely to determine a person's choice in a situation is not the one that offers the most useful information or counsel, but it's the one that is elevated in attention at the moment of decision. So this can have powerful implications for customer communication. And let's talk about maybe a few examples talking from community management. So in community, you can use it to direct attention to your service. If you think about not just what you're saying, but what you're bringing attention to, you can address things differently. So let's say somebody posts a negative comment about your service in your community, and of course you should address it and comment on it and apologize and all that, but you want to try to focus on the solution and your responsiveness more than the issue in your responses. Also, you can use the idea of attention to strategically start doing other posts that may counteract that. Start saying positive things. Start sharing customer service stories that maybe show you not performing whatever the negative comment was. So another cool application, and we'll stick with community here, but it really applies to a lot of different digital communication. So there was a study, this was really neat. They tried to get an email. It was basically to get an email for a new soft drink. So you give the email, you get a coupon for a new soft drink, and they pretty much asked people straight up, hey, would you give us your email? We'll give you a coupon. You can try this new soft drink. And about 33%, a third of them, volunteered their contact info. Then all they did was they changed one thing. They added a question first. And they said, do you consider yourself somebody to be adventurous and who likes to try new things? Then they made the ask, will you give us your email for the soft drink? 76% gave it after that one sentence was added. After they moved attention from the giving of the email to the person being adventurous and are you somebody who likes to try new things? Once they shifted attention to their sense of self and their sense of adventure, the percentage shot up from 33% to 76%. So how could you apply this, say, in a community? Well, let's say you're doing a makeup brand and you're about to release a new product, or you have a new product released, or you're in the middle of a sale. Well, the great part about community is you have a lot more control over the conversation, which means you can be strategic about your approach. So I add it in, look, I'm a guy, I'm just going to start here. I don't know why I picked makeup. It's just what came up when I was thinking about this. But maybe you post a question, what's your favorite color family for summer, red or green? I have no idea if that's something they would ask. And that's fun. It may be a fun question. This type of question you see people do on social and communities to get engagement. But if you're in the middle of a sale, or if you're in the middle of a product launch, what if you asked a question that was a little more strategic? How important is investing in your appearance? That's a lot different than asking what their favorite color is. And it can still be a good question. It can still get engagement. It can still get discussion. But it also gets people focused on what you want them focused on. The idea of investing in their appearance and thinking about, are they someone who invests in their appearance? And when they say yes, they're committing that they are that person. So this principle can be really powerful with your teams. Okay, so we're going to move into, we've obviously been sprinkling application throughout. We're going to move into some really dedicated focus to application. So let's slide back into negativity bias. This was actually a sign. I was doing a workshop in Dallas and was out to dinner, and I saw this walking through the strip mall and had to take a picture. Parents, please do not drop off your children and go run errands. We are not a daycare. Now, what is wrong with this sign? Besides everything. It's negative. It's accusatory. It's even sarcastic, right? We are not a daycare. What type of message does this send to a potential customer? A terrible one. Okay, well, it may be a problem, and that's a liability issue. It may be something you want to address. You don't want children running around without supervision. So here's how another company did it. Now, you may have seen signs like this before. Unattended children will be given an espresso, sugar, and a free puppy. Now, it's a different approach. It has no negative language. That's the first thing. It's very important. Second, it's funny. It uses humor. Now, humor can be very dangerous, and you definitely have to be careful. And in fact, I don't know if you can see it because the slide's a bit small, but there at the bottom, there's a little line. It says, "This is a joke." So for anybody who didn't know that it was a joke, it confirms it. But that's a simple example, but it shows how we can transform language. So we're going to go through just a few more examples here. All right, so we don't hear this as much anymore. It's a little less common, but for those who are my age or older, it's certainly something that used to be very common. Unfortunately, we don't take American Express. And regardless of whether they should take American Express or not, how could we say that better? We are happy to offer you payment options, including cash, check, Visa, and MasterCard. That uses a keyword, options, which is a very powerful keyword, and it's focused on what they can do, not what they can't. No refunds after 14 days. This is still very common, 14 days, 21 days, whatever it may be. For your convenience, we gladly accept refunds anytime within 14 days of purchase. Now, it seems like a subtle shift, but if you look, one is focused on what somebody can't do, and it's focused on their limitations. The next one is focused on them for your convenience. We gladly accept, and it's positively framed. Unfortunately, we talked about unfortunately. We know what comes next, bad news. As much as I would love to or like to or any variation, it's still a bit of a trigger, but it's milder. It's not, unfortunately, and but are huge trigger words. So try to temper it down as much as I would love to, and then deliver the next piece. We can't, don't. All these words can be very powerfully, have a powerful negative impact, excuse me. What if we said we can only? Now, a lot of the stuff seems obvious and almost basic, but we see it all the time. And we see how companies use it all the time. And as I've worked with companies, I've seen how much more powerful their customer-facing language can become. So one example of this is terminology transformation. So I was doing a workshop. It's for a real estate company in New York, and we were doing training, and we were working on language. We were working on this transformation language. And they started telling me about their move-in inspection. I was like, move-in inspection? What's that? Is that a good experience? Is it? Oh, they said, oh, it's great. We bring them a basket. We do all this stuff. It's really a positive experience. We try to make a great impression. Then I said, okay, well, everybody in the room, raise your hand if you think inspection is a positive word. Of course, no hands went up. And so I suggested, what about welcome orientation? And that's the term they use today. And the moral here is, don't accept what's always been done. You know, we get these terms handed down to us from years of business. We get these form names and things like this, and we don't look at them with fresh eyes. And there's a lot of opportunity to improve. And I'll preface this by saying some forms we don't have control over. Some of us have government forms. Some of us are just in huge corporations and nothing's going to happen. It's the way it is, or legal counsel's weighed in, and that's fine. But if you focus on the things you can impact, you'll be able to find all kinds of ways you can really improve the language and the communication. And the first thing is just having fresh eyes. So here's another example, and I'm not in the healthcare field, but I went online and I found we've all filled one of these out. It's a health information release authorization form. I will say that again. Health information release authorization form. Okay, so release, we're giving up control. That's a negative right there. Authorization, it's okay. It's a stuffy formal word, and it's very tied up to giving up control. So even though we have the power to authorize, we're authorizing our lack of control. And form's just a negative word, much like inspection. Nobody likes filling out a form. If I ask you to fill out this form, do you usually feel a sense of joy? Of course not. So what about if we change health information release authorization form to health information sharing agreement? Now you can still have all the CYA language and the legal mumbo jumbo inside the form, and hopefully you put the same lens on that as well and see what you can change. But just changing the title, just somebody handing a patient a health information sharing agreement can have a positive impact and make a great first impression compared to the other. Okay, so signal stripping. And this is, we've talked about the fight or flight and all of the sort of how the brain and the evolution. And one of the things we've evolved to do, obviously, is to read each other. We've evolved to read facial signals, to read tone of voice, to read body language. These were how we used to determine if somebody was a friend or a foe. And each time we have one of these signals removed, it can provide a very challenging communication experience. So when you start talking about moving to the phone, what have we gotten rid of? We've gotten rid of all facial expressions. If you move from the phone to, say, email or a community, well, now we've gotten rid of tone of voice, we've gotten rid of body language, we've gotten rid of facial expressions, and we've gotten rid of a lot of those signals we are biologically evolved to use to understand meaning and to understand signals. So we all sort of know this intuitively, but often we don't use it strategically. So you want to think about signal stripping, and you want to think about your different approaches to channel. And we all talk about omni-channel and how to approach different channels. But I often try to reframe this conversation for people and say, look at it from the standpoint of signals. What signals don't we have? What signals do we have? And how do we need to adapt our communication accordingly? All right, so we're going to do a little digital example here that will tie in a few of these things together. This is a letter I found that was essentially recommended online as a good customer service letter. This is an example like you can use in your own business. And I want to take you through it because I think traditionally we would think this is a good letter. So I wanted to apologize to you for the bad service you received the other day. I'm appalled by Mandy's treatment. So it apologizes, it acknowledges the situation. It states the credo that we believe in customer service and tries to make this an exception. But let's look at it perhaps through the lens we've been using today. So let's talk about priming. What do we have here? Bad, appalled, saddened, bad. Now this is only the first paragraph of like a 4-paragraph letter. And I can assure you the rest of the paragraphs had a similar bent. So what are we doing? We're priming negativity. It's okay to say one or two if you need to, just because you've got to form sentences that make sense. But here we're priming negativity. Also, what are we doing? We're talking about ourselves. I am appalled. We strongly believe. It saddened me. 3 of the messages in this, I think, 4-sentence email are about the person writing it. They're not about the customer and their journey and their experience and their emotions. And now we know that this is what the customer is going to focus on. They're going to see the bad language, whether obviously subconsciously or consciously, most likely subconsciously, but they're also going to notice that it doesn't strike them. It's not about them. They're talking about the person who's writing it is talking about how they feel. And that's a really powerful message to take away, because we can structure our language. We can structure these things much more positively, and we can be much more strategic about it. And I think if we think differently about communication, and we can find letters like this throughout our organizations, maybe not this, but we can find areas for improvement. So what I want to look at here as we start wrapping up a little bit is I want to talk about some strategies you can use for digital communication. It's going to tie in some of what we've done and some other strategies. All right, the first one is prime purposefully. And what that means is to realize that words themselves are creating an impact on the listener regardless of the sentences they are in. Just the words themselves have an impact. So if your goal is agreement, if you want to be strategic, you would take a look at your text and Focus on making sure words like agreement or cooperation are in there, or even if it's an internal document, maybe teamwork. Next is de-emphasize negative words and emphasize positive words. We're talking about priming, positive versus negative light. The more negative words you can remove, the better. And the better you can do at sort of not stimulating that subconscious fight or flight trigger, those hormones and stress-inducing hormones we talked about earlier. Reframe positively. So this is about changing the actual approach, how we communicate, right? We went over this, we did those examples, and what will amaze you though is if you do go through your standard emails, even your signage, perhaps even like your rules, your community rules, you'll be blown away by how much negatively phrased language there is. And if you go in there with that lens, like I'm going to remove everything negative, and if it's not everything, that's fine. But if you go in there with that lens and that approach, you can really make some significant changes. Right, direct attention to where it can be most productive. And we could do an entire presentation just on this. This is so powerful. But just remember, what's focal is what's important. So you want to direct the customer's focus as purposely as possible. You want to direct it to create the best experience possible and to foster the best relationships possible. All right, compensate for the lack of signals. So obviously, we just talked about this, but when you talk about digital, there's a couple ideas that are specific you can use. First one is avoid delivering bad news. Now, if you're Netflix and you have a policy change and you have 20, 30 million or whatever, however many customers they have, you're going to probably send an email. But don't start there if at all possible. It just depends on your scale, your organization, what the news is, who it affects. But whenever possible, you want to deliver bad news in the most rich communication channel possible. And if you don't, then you want to start, if you have to do it digitally or if you have to do it with a lack of signals, then you want to structure the communication sort of strategically. One way to do this, and everyone I'm sure has heard of this, is the sandwich technique, which is put in the good news, squeeze in the bad news in the middle, and end on a positive note, end with some good news. And this has been around forever, but it truly, what's interesting about some of these techniques, and you look at Dale Carnegie as well, what's super interesting is how much the science has borne out some of these techniques. So what we know now, what we've learned, we now have science on first impressions. We have science on something called the peak end rule, which means we remember the last thing we experience. We find out that the sandwich technique has a lot of validity. The next thing, I get questions when I'm doing training, and it's one of the most interesting questions to me, is people have asked me how to write an email. So how do you use all this in an email? And obviously I can't go into that in detail, but I'll give you a couple of principles. And this is for high stakes emails. This isn't for, oh yeah, sounds great, I'll talk to you at 1. But when the stakes are high, when you're trying to deliver a powerful message, whether it be a customer issue or a sales pitch, whatever it may be, is basically think of skimming. Use bullets, use headers, use italics, emphasize positive messages. And remember, I have a chapter in Be Your Customers here that's everybody is rushed, everybody is stressed. And I always try to keep that in mind when I'm structuring communication. And if you can focus your emails around, sort of structure them like a brochure, and that doesn't mean 4 colors or pictures, it just means in a brochure we're trying to draw people's attention to certain things. And you can do that in an email as well. All right, next one, and this is actually a great application for those of you with communities or managed communities. There's a fancy word called homophily, and it's basically the extent to which pairs of individuals are similar in age, gender, education, lifestyle. And the research proves that the similarity of individuals predisposes them to more interpersonal attraction, trust, understanding than they find with dissimilar individuals. So we tend to affiliate with others that share similar interests, and we know that sort of instinctively again, but we know this is truly a psychologically proven principle. So in a community, what would you do? You could emphasize common areas for the group, even possibly when appropriate, introduce community members to each other, form subgroups, interests. You'll have to find the strategies that work in your community, but always remember anything you can do to emphasize common ground and to emphasize the commonality of your community members can really help strengthen ties. Finally, strategically support the community leader credibility. So research shows that to be perceived as more credible, you possess greater expertise and you're less prone to bias. So you want to emphasize the credibility of the natural leaders in the community. You want to build up the people you know are your evangelists and leaders. Possibly you could introduce them to new members with permission, but you want to really see if you know they're evangelists for the brand, help them build their credibility, because they're going to have more credibility being not the company than the company will have. However, the company can also have a lot of credibility as well. So what you want to do is you want to protect the perception of bias. So your moderators, your company handle, whatever it is, you want to always consider that the less biased you can seem, the more credibility you're going to have. And you can be strategic about how you approach your communication, bearing this in mind. All right, so finally we are wrapping up at the end here. I know this has sort of been a whirlwind and we've moved fast, but we've got a lot of information to pack into just about 30 minutes here. So finally is, how do you do all this? And I'm going to knock through this really quickly, but it's a simple process. First is catalog, and that means just figure out all of your communication, collect it all. You obviously start with written communication or scripts, anything that's tangible, and just collect it. Then you want to organize it. And what does that mean? That means break it down by different categories. What's phone, what's signage, what's emails. And then start with the repeatable stuff, the standard communication, and apply an 80-20 lens. So find the 20% of communication that gets you 80% of the results, or that's 80% of your communication, and start with those first. Next is assess, and that means apply everything we just talked about. Apply these filters. How are we priming? How can negative language be made positive? What are we drawing attention to? How are we presenting negative information that we do have to present? And then finally, transform, which simply means take all of this and attack it. Look at the language and see what you can do, and see how you can make it more in line with these principles and make it more strategic and psychologically sound so that you have a great impact on your listeners and can create better customer relationships. All right, well, thank you so much. It's been an honor to have your attention for this little bit, and you can always feel free to connect with me via email, LinkedIn, or Twitter, and I am going to turn it over now, and we'll be around for Q&A.
Yeah, so Adam, this is Rick, and I really appreciate you walking us through this. I think communication is critically important, and especially in our day and age. So according to some industry surveys that that we've seen from Gartner, something like over 90% of businesses now compete primarily on the basis of customer experience. And so, as products and goods and even, digital products become more and more commoditized, the customer experience is what really matters. And language plays a huge role in making that happen, right? And so this customer experience revolution, or the need to compete on the basis of customer experience, has touched companies of all sizes, large, small, and across every industry, whether you're in media or in retail or CPG or, financial services. And so it's touched everyone as entrepreneurs and executives recognize that, customer centricity is no longer the task of just like a single department, but it's a philosophy that an enterprise has to apply to the entire enterprise. It has to go company-wide, and language plays a huge role in doing that. One of the things that we've done, and for those who aren't familiar with Fuel Cycle, we're an online community platform that enables enterprises to connect with their customers and prospects to gain further insights and understanding, and learn from people over time. And so we provide this platform for insights, for customer experience measurement, and communications plays a huge role in making that happen. So thinking about a quick story to tell, one of our clients, a large national retailer, uses their community for a variety of research projects, including concept tests, product testing, and even communications testing as well. So a couple of years ago, thinking about this organization, they experienced a very public, very challenging event that didn't didn't look good in the public eye. And so they needed to quickly push messaging into the market to reaffirm their commitment to customers. And with their online community, they're able to quickly test multiple versions of their message and find a message that resonated with their audience. So having the Fuel Cycle community on and available to them allowed them to test and iterate on that messaging in hours and days rather than in weeks and months. And so they've been able to successfully refine their messaging over time as well to resonate and to work better with their customers. So Ashley, go ahead and kick it over to you for any questions that we might have.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Rick. Thank you, Adam. That was so informative. And, I think, no matter, like you guys said, no matter what role you have in the organization, if you're, talking directly, if you're like a frontline employee at a retail, if you're a marketer or even somebody working in customer support, language plays a huge role because we all play a part in the journey that the customer takes with the brand. So I think this is very informative for all of us today. So I want to be respectful of everybody's time and make sure we end at the hour, but I also want to have some chance to answer the questions that we do have. But wanted to quickly remind everybody, if you do have questions, please submit them through the question box or chat. But I'm going to start with the first question that comes from Mark, and I'm going to send this over to you, Rick. He asked, what tools do you have to evaluate language inside your community?
Yeah, that's a great question, Mark, and thanks for asking. I think there's a couple things. So number one, we have surveys inside the platform that allow us to mark up images or documents or marketing collateral. You can run any type of survey you'd like inside our community, and we also have discussion boards and live chat features inside our platform that allow us to get a lot of unstructured organic data from community members. And in the back end of our platform and available to our customers, we run text analytics and sentiment analysis to understand how people are talking about the brand under consideration or other topics. So really there's a couple tools available there. Obviously, the surveys for evaluation, but also sentiment analysis and text analytics for analyzing unstructured data.
Great, thank you, Rick. We have another question that just came in from Melissa, and I'm going to push this over to you first, Adam. So the language she asked, the language changes you talked about seem much easier to do for written or digital communication. How can you make those changes to people's language for verbal or in-person communication?
Well, absolutely. You're 100% right. It is always easier for written communication, digital communication. Obviously, formal training can be pretty powerful here because you're not just fixing a script, right? You're not just fixing an email. You're trying to change human behavior. That said, if you want to focus in on it yourself, what I would recommend is focus on 3 things at a time. And what I mean by that is find key phrases that your team or you have to say often. And I'll give you an example. I'm sorry we don't offer 2-day shipping to Alaska. I mean, that's a pretty standard type phrase. But maybe something like, I would love to assist with getting your shipment there as fast as possible. The good news is that shipping to Alaska used to take more than a week. We can now get it there as quickly as 4 days. Would 4 days work for you? So you're reframing and you're changing it to positive. But what you can do is you can do these in a sort of script-like fashion. So you can find the phrase or find the situation, find out what people normally say, and everybody will say different things, and then sort of script, okay, what's a positive way we can approach this? So do 3, train those, people are comfortable with that, find 3 more, and just use the 80-20 rule. What's going to have the most impact?
Wonderful. Thank you, Adam. So we had another question come in from Doug, and he asked, you recommend posting content in a community specifically to help direct attention to positive brand reinforcing topics. How do you do that without being obvious or crossing the line? So I'm going to push that over to you first, Adam.
I sort of think it's a logical, it's a very good question, because when you make that recommendation, you do have to be careful, and there's absolutely no hard and fast rule. The most important thing is using your judgment based on what happened, number one, and the mood of the community. So as a general principle, I'd say if you're trying to counteract a negative situation, just don't be too pointed. If it seems obvious that it's a response to what just happened, something happened, there was a thread complaining about X, and then you share a story, a day later where you got X right, well, that may be a little bit too on point. So sort of be strategic about it, judge the timing, and it may be something that you start to do this priming over time. I mean, one thing to know about all this psychology and brain science and all these techniques and principles, none of it is you do it and it fixes something type situation. It's all an accumulation. It's all a way of sort of just giving a better impression for the brain, for lack of a better word, over time.
And just to add to that real quick, Adam, I think think about the Fuel Cycle community platform. It's a great place to learn and iterate on your learnings around what type of communication your customer base expects to hear from you. And so, using the tools we discussed earlier, you have the ability to learn, to gather feedback from your customers, and find out what's going to work for them and for a broader customer group.
Great. Well, thank you guys. I think that is all the questions that we have today. So if anybody out there is on the fence, holding back, please, feel free to submit your questions really quickly. We'll make sure that we get them answered. But otherwise, I'm going to move forward to our thank you slide that has Adam and Rick's faces on there, so you can see that they're real people. It also has their contact information. So like Adam already mentioned, please feel free if you have any more in-depth questions that you want answers to, please feel free to reach out to either of them directly. Well, that seems to be it for today. So, Rick, Adam, I just want to thank you again for your time. It was really great information.
Thank you, Ashley, and thank you, Rich, and Rick. Sorry, and thank you to everybody for listening and being here. I hope you got something out of it.
Yep, thank you, Adam.
Thank you. Have a good day, guys.